Hello, I'm Pete Heinlein from English News Programs. I have listened to you say you were going to keep your head down on legislative issues, but sometimes we look to you as our representatives. You have a voice that maybe we don't have. There's one issue in particular that I know many journalists are concerned about, and that's legislation or language in the legislation that seems to change us from reporting about policy issues to supporting policy issues. Some of us see that as changing us from journalists to propagandists. And we would like to ask you and ask what you can do, what we can do to avoid this kind of a situation where we're going to lose our independence, we feel.
It's a great question, and let me take a shot at it, and then Ken, you should jump in. I remember my first week here in Washington when I first got nominated for this position, and I sat down and I read the VOA Charter, right? And I talked to David Enzor and I talked to others in the building. This is not a new situation, right? This is not something that suddenly has appeared with 4490 or something else. The charter of this organization, and VOA in particular, has a conflict in it, at least for me. Now, David and I have argued about this for years now, and I've talked to many of you about it for years now. I have a different feeling. When I read it, and I've read it probably, the charter now, probably 300 times, 400 times, we're asked to, on one hand, report on an unbiased journalistic basis, and the best way that we can show American values is by telling the truth to the world. And that's going to show people what our values are. Let other people be propagandists. We can show our values by telling the truth and telling it in a good and comprehensive and brave way. That's part of our charter. The other part of our charter is to tell America's story, and we are funded by the U.S. taxpayers. So we're not a private organization. We get our money from the U.S. taxpayers, and the other part of our mission is to tell America's story. Now, you can intellectually kind of square that circle, right, and say we can do both of them at the same time. And I think in most cases we do a wonderful job here of doing that, of being honest and unbiased journalists, but also telling America's story to the world. But there are often times when that comes into conflict, and personally, the language, and I'm going to get into 4490, and I apologize, but the language in 4490 on the reforms they want to make to the VOA Charter is incomprehensible to me. I've read it 100 times. It doesn't make it any clearer to me. To me, it makes it even more unclear. And I've been privately outspoken to people on the Hill and to the White House that I think that needs to be fixed. And I hope they do fix it, right? So... But I will say it's not new in my perspective. I think the history of this organization has always kind of had that conflict, and I don't think that's going to change even after 4490 or legislation passes, if it does pass.
No, I'm in agreement with Jeff, and I've also shared my concerns privately, as long as you're mentioning on some of the language in the reform bill with people I know on the Hill. All that being said, I do think occasionally, and this is rare, but occasionally there are stories that do come out of the newsroom that I wish, and I say this with the greatest of respect, that there's sometimes a tendency for stories to come out with kind of a quote from one person and then a quote from an American official, say a Russian official. And I've seen this occasionally. I would love to see greater analysis when a Lavrov quote is given equal stature to a Kerry quote. This isn't saying that we're not propagandists, but when Lavrov is clearly lying, which 90% of the time he is, I think we ought to try to, in a story, it would be a good thing to have a little more detail on this. And I know we've talked about this kind of stuff as a board, and the journalism generally is excellent, but occasionally stories creep through. Obviously, we're working on deadlines. News is moving fast. That's the one area which which doesn't, in my mind, at all violate the charter, but I'd like to see where I think we can square the circle and do it occasionally more effectively.
We have an obligation to be honest journalists, and if that means exposing dishonesty, we should expose it, even if it's Kerry, So